territories. These events did not impede the completion of the building, which was eventually finished only in 1953. However, instead of hosting the Ministry of the Colonies, it became the home of the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations headquarters, symbolizing the new established world order. Of course, like there is, I don't remember exactly what number, but I think it should be number 10 at least. No? Okay, perfect, with the United Nations flag over there. So today, what is left of the fascist imperial cityscape is a totally sanitized space with the FAO headquarters facing a memorial to the victims of the 9/11 attacks in New York in place of the Ethiopian obelisk, which has been returned to Ethiopia as a part of compensation plans for colonial crimes and reparations. And I guess it's number 8 with the 2 columns. I will elaborate after about like how all this process materialized. So let me start kind of again continue with the issue of this is a problem that deals with the historical memory, but it's also, since we are talking about reuse, and we are all talking about or trying to struggle with the idea of fascist heritage, colonial heritage, and the possible reuse. Well, this story, specific story, is a story of reconversion. I could say it is in the kind of the dark side of reuse, and we will see how somehow. So, in terms of reuse, we need to kind of understand this phenomenon like according to at least a couple of moves that I kind of understood. So by epitomizing a move from fascist colonialism to liberal world governance, the establishment of FAO in the former square of empire represents the first step in the neutralization of the presence of Italy as a colonial power. The Ministry of the Colonies was a symbol of central power, domination and subjugation. The many episodes of mass killings and the use of unconventional weapons, use of gas in the military campaign of in Ethiopian and warfare techniques, concentration camps in Libya and Ethiopia, inscribed Italian colonialism within the sphere of necropower, as is described by Achille Mbembe. In his critique on Foucault's notion of biopolitics, Mbembe argues that unlike modern Europe, where the government of people operates through sets of technologies which protect and foster life, for the creation of spaces of security, the example of the colonies is emblematic for the creation of lawless spaces as a way to justify the fabrication of death. In this way, the transition from the ministry of the colonies to the FAO headquarters is not a minor event. If we consider that the conversion from colonial state violence to UN multilateralisms consists of a shift from the necropolitical right over life and death to the exercise of power through the optimization of biological life in the post-colonial world. The second move is like, addresses the presence of FAO also in a way that demonstrates how issues of government in the post-war era were not peculiar anymore to a single nation state, but functions by involving an inclusive platform of state and super-state actors, where operation of biopower are carried out in a less pyramidal organizational form, and involve multiple knowledge and expertise permeating development and humanitarian efforts for the governance of food matters. So in this scenario, the architectural and spatial changes of the square across the year are not less relevant. The historical role and functions played by FAO represent the completion of a process that finds its premises in colonialism itself, and specific to the architectural project envisioned during fascism by Cafiero and Ridolfi, that has seen its form, aesthetic, and shape being preserved in spite of an approaching political transformation. So after the FAO's takeover in 1953, Italy as both a state and colonial power was no longer architecturally and aesthetically omnipresent in the space of Piazza Capenti. After 1953, the aura of vertical power of the ministry was relinquished to UN powers, embodying another transition from fascist and colonial verticality to the multiscalar technologies of world governance. So world governance usually, it's a concept and a practice that finds its roots in the history and politics of modern Europe. So in the idea that the world matters in businesses would necessitate an internationally recognized status quo, agreed partition and mutual cooperation between Western nation states, from slavery through the Enlightenment principle of a new cosmopolitanism to the expansion of capitalism brought by colonialism. So across the centuries, the spatial structures have always contained and documented these histories through material configurations. So bearing testimony of the political and social apparatuses related to the logic of world governance. From slave ship, plantation houses, colonial city plans, embassies, assembly halls, markets and stock markets, banks, detention, war centers, concentration camp, to contemporary informational networks. So in this scene it's interesting to see the way in which such transformations are aesthetically and architecturally given in a time when architecture itself has to readapt to a new zeitgeist. So the symbiosis, a kind of more traditional, strong relation between the monarch and the sovereign, somehow as is proved by no relation between Caesar Augustus in history, Pope Sixtus and Domenico Fontana, Napoleon III, Baron Haussmann, Adolf Hitler and Albert Speer, came to an end to a certain point as the post-war creation of liberal multilateralism constituted a new chapter in the longer history of world organization and architecture too. So still under the aegis of modernism, the decade following the end of World War II saw the rise of new projects that represented a new liaison between power and architecture. The headquarters of the United Nations in New York, the FAO-base in Rome, and the UNESCO in Paris, among many others, were the products finally of the spread of liberal power on a global scale. So, for instance, Oscar Niemeyer, who designed the UN Home in New York, stated, "We must have in mind what is the UN. We have to make something representing the true spirit of our age, of comprehension and solidarity. They reflect an organization that set the nations of the world in a common direction and gives to the world security." These are the words of Niemeyer. Similarly, Breuer, Zerfus and Pierluigi Nervi in '56 with the project of UNESCO, they envisioned a larger complex that could host important and universal art collections to, again I'm quoting, to evoke the peace that the institution has sought to establish and preserve throughout the world. So contrary to this, like the case of Piazza Capena and the FAO, seems looking like a little bit like an anomaly. And interestingly, let me do like an operational reuse, because I was listening to the theatrical performance that Mauro, Tatiana and Alessandro performed yesterday. And actually, like looking at few excerpts from the trial, I thought that one of the exchange between Lina and Giuseppe could have been perfectly in the mouth of Cafiero and Ridolfi, and I'm reading, so I'm also doing a bit of acting, if you don't mind. So Lina says, "We cannot just consider this building as an element from the past. The present, which is the future of 1939, is a result of that time, of that architecture tied to that ideology." Giuseppe: "But I designed it in 1936, it was another moment. I cannot be judged nowadays for what happened during the time. Only those who were present and part of that project can understand what was happening. Nobody external can judge us." So, to a certain extent, this was like kind of enlightening, and to me, it made perfect sense to this very case. So, where actually there is still a dilemma among the many transitions occurred in history, from fascist ideology to colonialism and the UN principle of inconstituency, what values the building stand for and what image of society it aims to be represented. So, of course, like we cannot like consider like the built form as a self-sufficient in this analysis. We need to look at the context, the historical dimension, and all the other actors that are part of this network, which is in the case specifically the obelisk of Aksum. So I will not tell you like how much is important and how it is important also to relate the peculiar case of Italy also in a greater scheme of how empires and colonialism used obelisks as a sort of distance marker in order to detach the community that were aiming to found in this connection with the founding violence of their action and politics. But let's say like that let's go immediately in the afterwar, let's say. So after 1945, like it took a few more years to see a true end of Italy as a colonial power, no? The post-war peace agreement in Paris in '48 saw the Italian aspiration to preserve substantial control over its ex-colonies crumbling. Moreover, Article 37 of the treaty stipulated the restitution of the looted works of art, objects of religious and historical value belonging to their legitimate owners. So the post-colonial relation with Ethiopia kept in suspension the reconciliation process until the restitution of the obelisk of Aksum as a gesture marking the end of colonial tensions. So the first segment of the stele, that was also like another way to address the obelisk, came back to Ethiopia on the 25th of April 2005, beginning a process of return and re-erection that was eventually completed 3 years later, leaving the square empty and the far so basically, till 2008, we're talking about this sort of solitude of the Fao building standing alone. Until when? Until after the removal, this apparent sense of emptiness was swiftly followed by a new phase of mutation that takes us to picture number 8. So, on the 11th September 2009, the mayor of Rome, at that time the neo-fascist Gianni Alemanno, in the presence of the US authorities, inaugurated the memorial to the victims of the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, 11th September 2001. The memorial, taking the space formerly occupied by the Aksum obelisk, consists of a plaque placed between two columns that were taken directly from the fountain of Curia Innocenziana in Piazza di Montecitorio in Rome. This new spatial intervention clearly reproduced the profile of Union's Twin Towers, and ironically, on the plaque are carved the words of philosopher George Santayana: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So, within this kind of context, we are really actually kind of experiences an act of disappearance, no? And the obelisk, this kind of matter, created created the basis for different transformations. So, as proven by the substitution of the stele, by the 9/11 memorial, a finally empty piazza could set a new beginning. So there, while colonial aesthetics and old-fashioned monumentalism have been lost, also the labile concept of memorialization is no longer bound to the container of the nation-state. And the former old colonial square has become a space for a discourse and memory that has become global, opening new avenues to explain the new symbolism and civilizational message behind world governance apparatuses. So in memory studies, such transmission of collective memory is addressed as cosmopolitan memory. So this kind of is a terminology that intends to prove how collective historical memory is not necessarily bound to the sense of belonging of the nation or an ethnos, but on the contrary, it informs the identity of those communities who did not experience or directly connect to specific and traumatic historical events. So, however, the experience of catastrophe following the Holocaust and World War II came to create a global political and moral space where collective trauma is held hostage by an exclusive Western interpretation and become inspirational for future military and non-military interventions to prevent outbreaks of major threats to the global order. So in this way, 9/11 acts as a new historical outbreak within the Western world, from which a sense of transnational solidarity started to spread around the perceived common sense of vulnerability and suffering of political violence. So this, proving as following, and by the following decades, has generated and still generates justification of military aggression and war on a global scale. So beyond such complex dynamic, the old colonial square offers an illustration and visual representation of such process. This is done through a discourse and memory that became global and by preserving a civilizational aesthetics that marks a continuity between the colonial and the post-colonial. In colonial Italy, slogans such as the civilized nation relied on the fascist equation between civilization and archaeology, as Mia Fuller has written extensively, which, while tracing a line of separation between moderns and barbarians, placed the Italian colonial experience into the realm of a more general European faith of exceptional primacy of culture in the Western world. On the one hand, the looting of the ancient funerary obelisk gave to the fascist regime the illusion of the following in the footsteps of ancient Roman civilization. And on the other hand, the recent replacement of the obelisk epitomizes a new Western civilizational spirit that has garnered an international consent to launch transnational acts of violent retribution from Afghanistan through the Levant to the Horn of Africa, justifying the war on terror on a global scale as an act of defense against barbarism. So in so doing, the square, while staging the dissolution of old-fashioned Italian colonial aesthetics, embodies the need to instate a post-colonial aesthetics that is necessarily wedded to the demands of extraterritorial crises and emergencies. This introduces ideological substance to the new relations of power. The representation in Rome of the nexus war and terror right of food provides a physical evidence of post-9/11 global security concerns that call for international intervention along the axis of security development, combining military issues with development and humanitarianism. So this gave the international public a pragmatic interpretation of poverty as dangerous, as the perilous path leading to invisible threats, risks, and fear. Victims can turn into enemies, and today's victim can transform into tomorrow's perpetrators, becoming the object of concern and the potential target of both civilian and military technologies. So the aesthetic representation of such equilibrium and conflation of powers is perfectly demonstrated in the visual spatial encounter between the FAO and the 9/11 memorial, namely the new two monuments of post-colonial Rome. There, the colonial legacies have slowly vanished, while traces of national history were absorbed by the era of world governance and by its global discourse on memory. A spatial revolution that, by bringing the celebration of post-colonial technologies of government, has ultimately realized the aesthetic fusion between development and humanitarian practices with warfare. So, post-fascist Italy basically inaugurated a new phase that is inscribed in the larger idea of, like, kind of urban planning that is typically modern, so that is based on this kind of opposition between dirty and clean. So a new clean piazza finally in 2009 was finally established and designed. So this is something that usually addresses like a big issue of vulnerability, like in public spaces in post-fascist Italy, that we could call also as an experiment of dehistoricization in post-colonial Italy. I'm borrowing the word dehistoricization from the work of Michael Rothberg, who actually defines it in the following way, and I'm opening the quote. This phenomena cuts through the calcified distinctions of period and identity in order to create new ways of seeing history as a dynamic force field of intersecting stories. The other is a force of dehistorization that removes the intersecting stories from any relationship to power. So, however, despite being effective, this operation was not entirely successful, as the act of conversion or dehistoricization did not create a complete feeling of emptiness or loss. On the contrary, the process of historicization did not completely erase any relationship to power, but they simply produced new intersection as proven by the multiscalar apparatuses of world governance. This demonstrated the way such a depoliticization finds its historical roots in Italy's lack direct engagement with decolonization. So the oscillation that exists in between this historical time, staying even within the same forms, somehow open up the question whether it makes sense to inquire the meaning behind the architecture of the FAO headquarters, fluctuating between fascism and global liberalism. In this way, the question of loss of meaning cannot be excluded from this debate. So, but while this has kind of become central issues, it's the constructivist theory impacted architectural and spatial theories. In post-fascist and post-colonial Italy, this question belongs to the general debate about the role of fascist heritage, where the relics of fascism and colonialism have been normalized within Italian cityscapes, often escaping the critique and consideration of anti-fascist politics. So here concepts like deviation, dissociation, discontinuity, dispersion, and rupture that have challenged and contested the idea of an architectural knowledge embedded to power, authority, and violence, struggle until this very day with the problem posed by the immanence of fascist structure in an allegedly post-fascist world. So the specific case of the square and its chameleon architecture are, for me, a kind of interesting demonstration of this problem. Denis Ollier, in his book Against Architecture, asked a question that phrased in this way: should this esplanade be made into a place of memory and expiation, or one of laugh and forgetting? When he's thinking of the way Émile Zola described post-revolutionary Place de la Concorde in Paris as a public space that has changed meaning throughout time, having hosted both the weekly celebration of the Sunday life in Paris, as well as being the scene of the public guillotine during the Reign of Terror. So similarly to this issue, the dismantlement of meaning around the erection of the FAO headquarters and the replacement of the obelisk with the 9/11 installation constituted a clear attempt to reclaim the historical past. So loss and disappearance are here the purposes of a long social process of forgetting, long-lasting special cleansing, which eventually bear testimony to the evolutions of global politics and of different civilizational narratives across history. So overall, the loss and disappearance experience with the square echo what Ernest Renan first and Benedict Anderson then taught us, that any act of collective forgetting is crucial for the formation of national identity. So here we could bring again the issues of brava gente, colonialismo straccione, right colonialism, but yesterday that was already dealt with. So while it is true that the three historical transition symbolized by the square suggest a progressive detachment or separation from the fetishes and fascism, it is also true that this happens through depoliticization, which is manifested through erasure and through a practice that I define as a reuse by concealment. Alien to any reverent interpretation of architecture, reuse by concealment works through spatial interventions and conversion that resembles acts of repression. So the question of repression gains an important role if you think about the work of Giorgio Agamben in opposition to the notion of profanation. So against the profanation that Agamben defined as a system that, opening quotes, deactivates the apparatuses of power and returns to common use the spaces that power had seized, closed, Agamben introduces secularization, on the contrary, as a form of repression, which preserved the power structures. Thus, the political, and this is this definition, which is very kind of enlightening. It leaves intact the forces it deals with by simply moving from one place to another. Thus, the political secularization of theologian concepts does nothing but displace the heavenly monarchy onto an earthly monarchy, leaving its power intact. The case of the square, it kind of creates all these kind of controversies, and the acts of conversion and erasure in the square, instead of the division from or profanation and the activation of, as we see, operate through a sort of, I would say, more flat and critical transfers. So the moves from necropower to biopower first, then the nation toward governance, the colonial to the post-colonial, explains the way in which fascist colonial heritage is foundational to the understanding of the political, visual, and material manifestation of today's world governance. They also showed the afterlife of colonialism through the principles and rationalities of colonial and imperial rule that have survived in the absence of formal colonialism. So let me conclude now by saying that within a context that the discourse on memory and the elaboration of the colonial past intertwine with the definition of a new power, relations, and techniques of government over others, the question around the fascist colonial heritage still brings to the fore the difficult dilemma around the possibility of critical reuse or reorientation that can contribute to an effective and true decolonization. By discussing the cases of erasure and reuse by concealment that occurred in the square, actually. And we verified that because of the absence of any critical dislocation so far, or transgressive activity in the process of transformation, categories such as reimagination and subversion are struggling until this very day. Thank you.
you're bound to be up here with me. Okay, good. So I feel alive, holding up. I am looking forward to dinner as much as you are. So I'll try to be brief. Let me just fix this a bit. All right. So my name is Bagnato, and really this project is made by two people, and the second person is Anna Positano, who is hiding in the back there. She's a wonderful photographer and artist, and the photographs you are looking at are her work. So really this project, what I'm going to talk about is part of an ongoing research. It's the first time I'm presenting this part, so well, thanks everyone, and Alessandro and everyone else for the opportunity. As Emilio also did, I'm going to stick quite closely to one specific site, which is a town called Arborea, formerly Mussolinia, in the western part of Sardinia. It's a new town that was founded in the 1920s. So just to say, this research is part of a much broader project I've been doing since some years that's called Terra Infecta, and it's an ongoing visual archive that looks at how disease and health transform space. So disease and health are not just metaphors, but really like a set of practices and technologies. So what I'm going to do now is really like to run you through the story of Mussolinia, through its ecology and through its natural elements, which I think works quite nicely with the idea of the planetary garden. So, number one, water. In 1882, Senator Luigi Torelli published the first map of malaria in Italy. While surveying the status of railway construction around the Italian peninsula, Torelli realized that the alarming number of deaths among workers was slowing down the infrastructural unification of the young state. In particular, Sardinia had the highest rates of malaria mortality, comparable to those of sub-Saharan Africa today, just to give you an idea. Because malaria thrives on the fertile coastal plains where runoff water collects, it had long been seen as a natural element of the peasant's life, just a consequence of bad air, which is what malaria means. But with Torelli's maps, malaria was reconstituted as both a public health problem and a problem of infrastructural circulation. In 1918, a group of investors and engineers based in Milan set up a private company called SBS, tasked with building a dam on Sardinia's main river. The seasonal water flow was to be regularized to allow for the commercial production of hydroelectric energy, which is something that was happening quite a lot in Italy at that time, both in the Alps and in the Apennines. The inauguration of the dam in 1919 resulted in the creation of Lago Omodeo, Europe's largest artificial lake. The lake, which is still there, is only a few kilometers away from the birthplace of Antonio Gramsci. Among the 16,000 workers that took part in the construction of the dam was Emma Gramsci, Antonio's sister, who caught malaria and died in 1920. A commemorative stone by the dam reads, "May God look and impregnate." The second goal of the Milanese project was thus the creation of an area of irrigated agriculture downriver from the new lake, so that the dam could also help to control the flows of irrigation, right? So this form of cultivation was presented in open contrast with the traditional economy of Sardinia, which is actually based on a complex balance of shepherding and rain-fed cultivation on commonly held lands. So there was no irrigation at all whatsoever on the island. Under the guidance of engineer Angelo Bodeo, which is a character of a lot of colonial enterprises of Italy, the SBS company devised the drainage of a Terralba Valley, an 8,000-hectare region of malarial marshlands in the western coast of Sardinia. By taking advantage of laws enacted after Torelli's maps showed how bad malaria was, SBS expropriated the marshlands, at once erasing the local economies of fishing and hunting. So in the documents of the time, much is made of the opposition between a supposedly lifeless, immobile water of the coastal marshes and the flowing, productive and canalized channeled water of Bonifica land reclamation. And so I was actually thinking about how Jonathan Littell, for example, talks about fascism in terms of the dichotomy between sec and humid, so dry and humid. And then what happens is that after Benito Mussolini seizes power in 1922, the government appropriates the reclamation project by nationalizing the company, this private company, SBS. And the town that was under construction at the center of the valley is renamed as Villaggio Mussolini and later Mussolinia. And it's completed in 1928. And it's no coincidence that Mussolinia's most architecturally important building is actually several kilometers outside of the town, and it is a water pump, an hydrovora, which you can see is the second picture from the bottom. So it's this beautiful kind of futuristic water pump, which was built in 1935, and it's still working, and if it were to stop, the entire valley would be resubmerged by the water within days or weeks. Number 2, trees. A 100 by 400 meters grid, roughly the same module as Manhattan, overlays the Teralba Valley. The plots of arable land are enclosed by thousands of eucalyptus trees, which are a common species throughout Sardinia. Yet eucalyptus is not native to Europe, but was imported from Australia in the latter part of the 19th century, under the assumption that it would absorb excess water from the soil, and thus reduce the habitat of malarial mosquitoes. This is not true. One of the main promoters of eucalyptus planting was Luigi Torelli, the same Luigi Torelli behind the 1882 malaria map, who even had a variety of eucalyptus named after him, Columbia torrelliana. As Mussolinia was being built, the majority of Sardinians were still living in the uplands and in the mountains, actually, where the friction of the terrain limited the presence of the central states. The scarcity of resources encouraged inhabitation in the form of dense towns far apart from one another. And outside the town were the commonly held lands, whose use was controlled by a complex system called villazzone. The process of Bonifica continued a larger historical trend of incorporating land within a system of capitalist production throughout Italy. In 1820, the King of Piedmont and Sardinia had signed the Enclosures Act, which allowed landlords and municipal authorities to fence off plots of common lands for cultivation. The Sardinian population, of course, starkly opposed the enclosures, but the state reacted with violent army repression. The central power exploited the divisions between shepherds and farmers, constructing the former as lawless and stateless barbarians. From the 1880s, the pseudo-scientific theories of Cesare Lombroso gained traction in the collective imagination of Italy, of Italians. Alfredo Niceforo, who was a Sicilian, a disciple of Lombroso's, wrote a book on Sardinia, which purported to demonstrate that the mountainous shepherding region was a criminal zone. And he connected this criminal zone with an imagined racial geography of Europe. All the while, northern Italian companies were taking advantage of the Enclosures Act by pillaging and destroying forests. In the span of a century, 80% of Sardinian forests were felled, and the timber was used for stalls and railroads. If you go to Sardinia now, you might think that the hills have always been barren, but they were not. So the destruction of the trees and the loss of the commons changed the climate of the island, increasing the runoff of rainwaters, and by consequence, worsening malaria. So this is also to challenge the idea that Sardinia had always been infected. Intermission. From the prison notebook number 19 of Antonio Gramsci. Quote, "The poverty of the South was historically inexplicable for the popular masses of the North. They did not understand that unity had not taken place on the basis of equality, but as hegemony of the North over the South in a territorial version of the town-country relationships. In other words, the North concretely was an octopus which enriched itself at the expense of the South, and its economic industrial increment was in direct proportion to the impoverishment of the economy and the agriculture of the South. The ordinary man from northern Italy thought rather that, if the Mezzogiorno made no progress after having been liberated by the Bourbon regime, This meant that the causes of poverty were not external to be sought in objective economic and political conditions, but internal, innate in the population of the South. And this all the more since there was a deeply rooted belief in the great natural wealth of the terrain of the South. There only remained one explanation: the organic incapacity of the inhabitants, their barbarity, their biological inferiority. These already widespread opinions were consolidated and actually theorized by the sociologists of positivism, acquiring the strength of scientific truth in a period of superstition about science. The Mezzogiorno was thus reduced to the status of a semi-colonial market, a source of saving and taxes, and was kept disciplined by measures of two kinds. First, police measures, pitiless repressions of every mass movement with massacres of peasants. And second, political measures, personal favors to the intellectual stratums in the form of jobs in the public administrations and of license to pillage the local administration with impunity. Unquote. Number 3, the last one, drains. Most of the public buildings and homes in Mussolini were designed by the engineer Carlo Avanzini in a mild, turn-of-the-century eclectic style, with rustic yellow plaster and stone finishes, as you can see from the church here. The early settler homes attempted to reproduce the tropes of northern Italian farms so that the colony, of course, could be made to feel at home. But the street grid of Mussolini is unashamedly modern, setting it apart from the new towns of the Agropontino that actually attempt to replicate a kind of traditional and medieval urban form. There is only one square in Mussolini, which is nothing but the crossroad of the two main axes, around which the town hall, the primary school, the hotel, the church, and the workers' club are all clustered. On the bell tower is inscribed the word "Resurgo," I resurrect. In 1933, it was deemed necessary that the fascist presence be made more explicit and visible. So the Sardinian architect Giovanni Battista Ceas was commissioned to design the Casa del Fascio and Casa del Balilla. And the Casa del Fascio is just at the bottom, as you can probably guess. And so this is a kind of more openly rationalist style, of course. The funny thing is that the town square was already there, with the church and everything. So Ceas had no choice but to locate the Casa del Fascio and Casa del Balilla in the periphery of Mussolini, at odds with their purported grandeur. So, but this notwithstanding, in 1935, Mussolini was at last ready for the official visit of Mussolini. Following the regime's racial mythology, the new lands could only be populated with the fittest of human types. So the first inhabitants of the colonies, as the regime would call them, were from Veneto, so from the northeast of Italy. So this is because the peculiarities of Sardinian society translated in a small nuclear family with a strong tradition of female independence. This was, of course, was not considered suitable to what the regime was trying to achieve, the settler life. And of course, Sardinians were not considered Italian enough because they were shepherds and not farmers. In contrast, women from Veneto were prolific, and the men were used to agricultural labor. So 4,000 families were lured to Sardinia with the promise of a plot of land to cultivate. The land was not given to them, but it was the property of SBS, which would lease it to the colony using an old system of mezzaderia. What is really absurd, I think, is that each family was closely scrutinized politically and morally before they were allowed to depart, and as was the fertility of women. Those who did not have enough male children had their application rejected. Once in Mussolini, SBS kept the productivity of the colony closely in check. The settlers' bodies and behaviors were also disciplined through the complex set of hygienic protocols that were meant to reduce the incidence of malaria, which was still there. For example, gathering outside in small groups at night was not permitted. So somehow I think you can start to see that sowing the land was not just an economic project, as the Milanese had intended, but also a political project to produce imperial subjects, soldiers, through the control of heterosexual reproduction. As is known, the Latin verb colere, which is the root of to colonize, meant both to inhabit and to cultivate. And so Mussolini was a key battle site also for Mussolini's Battaglia del Grano, the quest to increase Italy's production of wheat to the point of self-sufficiency, which started in 1925. So this increase in wheat, in grain yields, was achieved largely through the work of an interesting character named Nazareno Strampelli, who was a geneticist. He had been experimenting with new crossbreeds of wheat since the turn of the century. In 1925, Strampelli set up an experimental research station in Sardinia, where he developed a range of sementi elette, or chosen seeds, with names such as ardito, which means literally the brave wheat. So imagine that even eating a plate of pasta was a patriotic act. And these new sementi, these new breeds were planted all around Mussolini. Strampelli's wheat varieties were so adaptable to different climates that they were exported to Central and South America, where they would be taken up by Norman Borlaug as the basis of the Green Revolution. In a final twist of the story, techno-political power comes again to Mussolini when the Rockefeller Foundation, with reconstruction funds after the Second World War, chooses Sardinia as the place to test the newly discovered DDT. So between 1946 and 1948, the entire island of Sardinia is sprayed with insecticide with the purpose of eradicating malaria and, of course, of making the land fertile. In the post-war order, so agricultural land all around Italy was finally distributed to the farmers themselves by the center-right government, in agreement, of course, with the Marshall Plan, to prevent the possibility of a communist unrest in the countryside. I leave it here. Thanks. I don't know if Anna, you would like to say a couple of words about the photographs? We come down. Or we come down to get you.
Can we hashtag?
Sorry?
Hashtag.
Yeah.
No, I would love to go up there, but I don't get why. How? No. If I can climb, great. I will. Andrea invited me to join this project, some doubts came out. So I was wondering, like, am I legitimate to shoot and speak about a place where I do not belong, as I come from the continent? The continent is the way Sardinians call other Italians who don't live in Sardinia. And moreover, what if the exoticism of this land, hello students, would fascinate my gaze, and in a way my gaze would become a sort of imperialistic gaze. You know, there are a few, there is a good iconography about colonies and I mean, images of exotic places from the 1800th century, and photography was a way to promote colonialism within the various countries. Actually, what concerned me the most was the celebrity approach of photography, toward fascist architecture. The stereotypical and the exotic imagery of Sardinia was a problem too. You know, fancy islands, fun, nice beaches, people having fun during the summer. So that was really risky to say something about Sardinia that wasn't that. So I recall to myself Munari's words, everyone sees what they know. So that basically means that your own background, in a way, affects the way you perceive your world. So, aware of that and of my position of a photographer from the continent, I tried to focus on the territory of Mussolini as it was a familiar landscape, and that was quite easy. During the fascism, as Andrea said, this land was colonized by farmers coming from Pianura Padana, mostly from Veneto area. And there are many similarities between this colony and the motherland in terms of landscape. Part of my family comes from Veneto, so I was quite used to see these landscapes. At the same time, the fascist buildings of this town recall the same style of those that are scattered around Italian cities. So you would always recognize these shapes around Italy. You can tell that these buildings come from a certain period, historical period. So my familiarity with such shapes made me approach the buildings without any celebrative or indulgent attitude. I didn't want that because, you know, it was mostly a political stance for me. So you can find cars, temporary structures, uneven floors, wires, and whatsoever that are part of the daily life of a building. And I actually chose to have those elements. Another thing that I found during my research, which has literally just started, that's the first time that we show these pictures. So, beside the familiar landscape, what caught my eyes is the variety of plants that you can find in that area. The vegetation of Mussolini is mostly the consequence of the massive intervention that took place at the beginning of the 20th century. Greenery is everywhere, from cultivations to trees that favor the drainage of the land. But most importantly, what I would like to focus in the future are the spontaneous plants that reclaim their space as a form of vegetal resistance, in a way. So in this series of photography, it's called not only to document Arborea's territory, but it is called as a means to question and interpret the impact of colonization in this area. Thank you.
As yesterday, we thought of ending the day with a conversation. I think we're not as many now, so I mean, please come forward and we can, I mean, readjust the chairs. So, I mean. Sorry. allowed to speak and then what to say and what to ask. But I mean, we can also start with, it's also okay to be, I mean, silent for a while, but if there's not that anyone would like to start with a question or reflection or thought, then I'm happy to come with the microphone. I'm very happy to hear.
Thank you. Andrea, and to everybody here with this, thank you very much for today's presentations. It's been very enlightening. And Andrea, your presentation was definitely really interesting, how the regime was also not just through the physical architecture, but also through nature, manipulation of nature. It's like for me, this is a reflection. Maybe it's not a question. It's rather a reflection. It becomes very, how do you say, a little bit afraid of how scary such a system can work, that is both has an impact on the mental mind of people, the architecture, but also through the nature, also having that kind of impact. It's a 360 degrees propaganda machine taking on all the place. And that was also what you were informing about the villages in Syria, in Libya, how it was so difficult to get rid of this machine. And so my question is, again, I tried to see through your research, do you see this kind of pattern somewhere taking place today in a new way, of course, with new technology, but some kind of the same patterns?
Should we collect thoughts from you before we answer?
If there is, okay, but while people are thinking in that
Okay, sure. But I just, okay, let me reply very quickly. Well, I think, of course, if you think about, there are, I think, many ways in which today the kind of exploitation of nature and pillaging of natural resources on the one hand, but also really the manipulation of nature and the creation of new environments is taking place. Indirect lineage with colonialism, as it was said already yesterday, in a way colonialism, from the point of view of nature, I think it has never ended really, right? You only need to look at sub-Saharan Africa or Indonesia or wherever. So yes, maybe you don't have the same kind of openly political regime, but you have, I think, different, more subtle ways of in which I think these discourses on fertility, for example, operate.
The manipulation of nature is not an invention of fascism. We have for the Ponting Plain, we have the famous drawing of Da Vinci, who's also trying to regulate the water. Friedrich the Great in the 1750s did a lot of drainage in Germany, changing completely landscape of East Germany too. So there are lots of those kind of operations. So what we say nature, it's man-made landscape for sure. Examples. I'm thinking about the greater Cairo, which is now starting in the middle of the desert. There is this kind of willingness of the new town, of starting a new city, of moving into the nature, exploring it. I think it was not an invention of fascism, and it will probably go on for ages. This kind of, yeah, we can, yes we can.
The question was not addressed to me, but I just wanted to add something to what you said. Like, if we look at kind of more, we look at the greater colonial history, like I would say that the manipulation of the nature, and going back to the case of the desert, is something that you have in the Nakab now. And it's also interesting, like when we kind of like revolve of the mythologies and the lexicon that is used by Zionism, like using the desert, making the desert blue, is also something that we could, like, not invented by fascism, but is kind of like close to the discourse and to the practice in at the boundary of the desert in the north of Sahara, like in the area of Libya. So just like another element, if we want to kind of think in terms of continuities or kind of intersections between different colonial histories.
I just wanted to add to that. If you look at films today, where the Martian, I think, was about growing gardens on Mars in biospheres. It's a prelude to what we expect we're going to be doing there. So interplanetary conquest is also environmentally, is the interplanetary environment. So it doesn't stop. Yes, it doesn't stop there.
I think one dimension that I like very much how the three interventions were played together. It was this constant movement between, let's say, the inside and outside, or at least what can be perceived as inside and outside. So the looking how a town in Sardinia is very similar to, or there are certain analogies of a rural village in Libya. And maybe I'm wondering if, going back to also what we were discussing yesterday, about the fact that the ambition of colonization was to create this sort of territory. And somehow, if this can be also today a strategy to try to create these possible links that in a way can overcome the idea that there still exists an inside and outside. So how, maybe strategically, I'm thinking that this very precise investigation on sites, very precise investigation in villages, can also overcome something that I think emerged in a discussion yesterday, how one can study or engage into this beyond the national frame, and start really to realize what kind of alliance can be created by